Now, in the previous video, I mentioned that we're going to take a look at the preferential categories that are found in the 1965 Immigration Act. But before we do so, what I want to do is discuss a little bit of how the stage is being set for the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act. And, I can't overstate this enough how much the 1965 Immigration Act is going to drastically recast or reconfigure not only the landscape of Asian America, but also the entire country itself, the United States. It's going to be recast in terms of its ethno-racial composition. Okay, there's going to be a drastic difference between pre-1965 um, United States, right, in terms of ethnic um, variation, as opposed to post 1965. But again, we're talking about Asian American history, so we'll keep it focused on that Asian American immigration. Now, one of the first acts that gets passed is during World War II. And again, these are laws or immigration acts that are not excluding, but actually leading towards inclusion. And as I mentioned, this is the War Brides Act during World War II. And as you can imagine, you had American servicemen fighting in the Pacific during World War II, and they're marrying Asian women, taking them as brides. But of course, there's laws in effect during this time that prevents that from happening, as we know, right? Asian exclusion. So what the government does is pass a law that allows these servicemen to have their brides come over with them from Asia. Right. So this is the War Brides Act of 1943. And notice, women specifically were excluded from the laws, right? Let's remember the Page Act, and so on and so forth. The Japanese being an exception to the rule, as we recall. But things like anti-miscegenation laws when it came to Filipinos working in the West, certainly the Page Act. Gender exclusion was one strategy of preventing this formative family formation of Asians, right, and therefore preventing, this critical mass of Asian American population in the United States, all right. So the War Brides Act is one thing that actually runs counter to what we've seen in the past, and especially as applied to women. And by the way, I should mention this also. I mentioned this a while back in a different topic, but the aliens ineligible for citizenship provision that was found in the 1882 Exclusion Act, right, as part of a provision added to that, is going to be eradicated by the 1952 McCarran-Walter Immigration Act. Okay, that's why I'm mentioning it here. So that's the good aspect of it. Now, with the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act, you have Asians in America, however small a number, now they could actually be naturalized as citizens. And I mentioned here there's a bad aspect to it, right, in terms of Asian immigration. What is the bad aspect of the 1952 Act? Well, basically, they still barred Asians from migrating to the United States. It was this designated zone called the Asia-Pacific Triangle, so named because, on the map, they outlined this area that looked like a triangle. And within this triangle, it designated all the Asian countries that were not allowed to migrate. Certainly, it includes most of the Asian countries, with the exception of the Philippines. Why? As we know, the Philippines is a colony of the United States, but all other countries pretty much barred from immigration to the United States. Okay, now, towards the next decade, by the 60s, there's still anxiety held by nativists at this time. Okay, let's remember that the 1920s, 1930s was the high tide of nativism in our country as a reaction to all the different ethno-racial groups coming from Europe, right, and certainly from Asia. Well, they're still around during the 1960s, as you can imagine, and they were concerned about the debates swirling in regards to the changing of the immigration laws, specifically the 1924 one, right? There's already debates about repealing that because, as I discussed, there's the civil rights spirit of the age, certainly the Cold War context that we have to acknowledge, right? Soviet propaganda calling us out as being racist, a racist country against persons of color. So the architects of the law, the 1965 law, understood this. And the way they did this, the way they alleviated or appeased the anxiety expressed by nativists is by uh, the following reasoning. Well, they said Asians barely constitute 1% of the population of the entire nation. Even if we change our immigration laws and allow for families to come over, okay, and that's something I'll discuss, by the way, in the next slide, family reunification, which is part of the categories of the 1965 Act. But um, yeah, and this will make more sense when you see that. But it was reasoned to the nativists that Asians, being so small in number, even if they petitioned their relatives, their children, their spouses, their siblings over in their home country to come over to the United States, it would barely leave an effect on the racial composition of the United States because they're so small in number. Okay, so that's one way they appease the natives. In fact, I have a quote here. If you allow me to look for it, 1 second. Oh, here it is. You had members of nativist groups, patriotic societies such as the American Legion, and this group called the Native Sons of the Golden West. The Golden West was really California, okay? They were assured that Asians would not change the racial composition of America. And here is one quote from a American Legion member. He was remarking confidently on this. Quote unquote, Asiatics have far fewer immediate family members in the United States than Southern Europeans, and will automatically arrive in far few numbers than Italians, Greeks, and other Southern European stock. Yet, there is no sting in the new law to offend Asian nations. Asians will qualify on the same basis as others, though far fewer of them will be able to do so. Okay, so he's affirming that connection with the Cold War, right? You don't want to offend these Asian countries. You want to win their hearts and minds, rather, right? At the same time, practically speaking, so he believes, Asians will hardly make a dent when they petition their families to come over. Okay, so that's setting the stage. And again, this is the high tide of American liberalism. Okay, it's called the liberal consensus when you had Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, civil rights movement, right? Something called the Great Society, which was LBJ's sort of vision and his policies that aimed to improve domestic society, right? To eliminate poverty as much as possible, to improve education, to provide programs for the poor and welfare for those who need it, to provide housing for the middle class, so on and so forth, right? And because it was this pinnacle of our economic prosperity, we felt we could afford this, right? Very low unemployment, if none at all, a precipitous increase in standards of living. It was, again, this perfect time LBJ felt to, um, pass this as part of his Great Society program. Okay, now we're here in the slide with a list of the 7 categories of the 65 Act. Okay, so let me remind you what's being done here is you are eradicating the national origins approach where, immigration is based on race, right? The lighter skin, the higher ceiling allowed for annual immigration from that country, the lighter skin country. The darker the skin, very low ceiling allowed per year. So Instead of all that race-based quota system, that's the National Origins Act, right? We're replacing it with these categories, okay? And as I mentioned, they either deal with family reunification, or they deal with trying to attract highly skilled laborers, or even laborers or occupations in demand, right, where we have short supply. And it's a hierarchy of preference. What do I mean by that? It means that in any given year, for example, let's say 68, preference will be given to number one, unmarried children of U.S. citizens, and then the last preference will be refugees. All right. So if you look at this list, right, you see how a lot of them deal with family. Number one, number two, number four, and five. Okay. And if you look at it, it says, for example, unmarried children of U.S. citizens, right? So they could petition their children abroad to come over. And this is especially true, if you had war brides, right? If they had children abroad, you could apply to that. Let's say you had a servicemen stationed in Korea, in the 50s, 60s. They could bring their wives over, but now even their children. Okay, so number two, spouses and unmarried children of permanent residents rather than citizens, right? So if you're a permanent resident, you're given this the second preference. Go down to number four, married children of the age 21 of U.S. citizens. Okay, so again, adult children. And then number five is siblings, right? Brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens abroad. Okay, so that altogether, one, two, four, and five, is what we called earlier family reunification. This is what it's focusing on with the 1964 Act. Okay, but not exclusively. As we know, number three, it says professionals, scientists, and artists of exceptional ability. Number six says workers, skilled and unskilled, in occupations for which labor is in short supply in the U.S. So, all of this is part of this um, effort to attract foreign talent and foreign labor that's in short supply. There is a Cold War context to this, but in general, it's felt that in this growing global rivalry and competition, what we should try to do is attract potential talent from abroad to come over to the United States, right? And this is setting the stage for that. You're going to see different variants of this approach in future acts like the 1990 Immigration Act and so on and so forth. But number seven is refugees. And we talked about that already in the case of the Indo-Chinese, right? But they're at the very bottom, okay? When they passed this in 1965, little did they know that 10 years later, 1975, you're going to see this deluge of refugees coming from Southeast Asia, right, as we already discussed. Okay, so this is the 1965 hierarchy of preference, so to say. And I mentioned this earlier. The architects of the 65 Immigration Act firmly believed that the family reunification amendments here would primarily benefit immigrants from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, so let's say Jews, Italians, Greeks, Polish, and so forth. And it was believed that Asians in the United States at this time were simply too small in number, as I mentioned. So upon them petitioning their family members, there would be no appreciable rise or increase in the overall percentage of Asians, it was felt. And I, gave you that quote by the the nativist member of the American Legion, right? It kind of reflects that idea. But again, what the lawmakers of the Immigration Act and the politicians and certainly the nativist groups, what they were unable to predict was the use of chain migration. Okay, this is a social science term, chain migration by Asians and other third world immigrants that's now going to be possible through the 1965 Immigration Act due to these categories that we called family reunification preferences. Okay. All right. So, what do we mean by chain migration, first of all? Chain migration refers to the migration of a group of people from one region to a next, where they're basically following other members who previously moved to that region. Okay. So, it's this movement of following other migrants from the same region out of their host country to a new, out of their home country to a new host country. Okay, and they're basically following the trail already blazed by other persons from the same region previously. Okay, so that's chain migration. And what's going to happen is, even though my description of chain migration just right now is very general, here, what's going to enable that is exactly family reunification. Okay, it's going to allow family members to follow those immigrants from their families, right, who previously migrated to the United States, and they're going to follow suit, right? Before it wasn't allowable, but now with the 1965 Immigration Act, with these family reunification preferences, it is now enabled. So here's a typical example that might unfold. You'll have, let's say, a citizen from some Asian country, and they arrive at the United States, let's say as a college student. And eventually, let's say she gets a job, or she graduates, gets her degree, then gets a job at a, let's say, becomes prosperous. She has that certificate, right, from the Labor Department that allows her to work, that visa. And eventually, she becomes an immigrant. And once she becomes an immigrant, she could use that second category right here. Right now, you're a permanent resident, and you could bring over your spouse and then even your children, right, with number two. So that happens. And then after years of residence, the whole family now becomes citizens. And now they're able to use a preference in the immigration law. Let's say they could use the fifth preference, siblings of U.S. citizens. So they could use this to petition other family members. Okay. And then the same thing happens. Those siblings come over, they become immigrants eventually, thus able to take advantage of one of the preferences here, maybe the first, maybe the second, right? And what you see there is this just used over and over again, and it results in what social scientists called a multiplier effect, where what started as one small group, right, even one single person following another person in chain migration, it just multiplies, right, because it expands through different networks, through after years and years. Okay, so this is what's going to be taken advantage uh, by when it comes to Asian immigrants. As I mentioned, European immigrants or European Americans are not going to really take advantage of this family preferences, because Europe is, generally speaking, a state of economic prosperity or vibrancy. It'll be the Asians, immigrants, that take advantages. Now, I want to mention or emphasize this again. This is the unintended consequence of the 1965 Immigration Act. Again, the lawmakers, the architects of this law, the nativists did not foresee this happening, but that's exactly what happened. Okay. So, because of this, the chain migration, what you see is this recomposition again of Asian America. You certainly see the end of that gender exclusion, right? You see the end of that so-called bachelor society where it's all young men coming over, most of them unmarried, right? Now you have more families intact, right, and coming over. And now these intact families constitute most of Asian America, right? Not just single persons, right? You also see more skilled workers and less unskilled. Let's remember the sojourners coming from China, right? Or even from Japan, the dekasegi, right? You see much less of that. And you see this idea of permanent stay, right, as a goal, this notion of permanent stay in the United States. Now, you add to the mix the influx of refugees, category number 7 here. Let's remind us that this happens by the mid 70s through the beginning of the 90s. Vietnamese, Cambodians, Hmong, Laotians, right? And this is a different ethnic racial group, right? These four groups. And you also have more educated and professionals, right? Let's see number 3 here, professional scientists and artists of exceptional ability. So they come over. And of course, I talked about chain migration, right? They're going to come over and they're going to use these other categories related to family reunification that will lead to that multiplier effect. And then you see a spike in Asian groups that may have been here before, but with the 65 Act, it spikes. For example, the Filipinos will definitely take advantage of the Family Reunification Act. Koreans will do the same. And then you'll see new Asian groups like South Asians, right? There were some South Asians coming to work in the agribusiness in, the 1920s, but very few in number, but definitely with South Asia, let's say from India, you'll see them come over. And this is, they'll really, well, let me just say, they'll really take advantage. Number 3, professional scientists. Think, for example, of the Indian engineer or the Indian technician who works at Silicon Valley today, even, right? They're coming over as skilled laborers on what's called H-1B visas, right? They're temporary workers, but they're highly educated, highly skilled, and they're highly paid. But again, they're being attracted to the United States to work in our high-tech sector, right, rather than in India's. Okay, so you can now see how the 1965 is such an important part of contemporary Asian America because it exactly leads to this recomposition and recasting of what we think of Asian America.